the opportunity? No.
That was worth all two
Mr. Speaker,
I call the Honourable David Parker.
Mr. Speaker, John Key and the National Party always blame Christchurch or Greece for New Zealand's problems. Greece and Europe have had problems. Outside of Greece and Europe, average growth in the world has been 1.5% per annum for the period since National has been in government. Over that same period, New Zealand has grown under 1%, not 1% per annum, but 1% in 3 years. Mr. Speaker, the 53,000 people who last year went to Australia didn't go to Australia because of Greece's problems. They went to Australia because of New Zealand's problems. And it's time that the government fronted up and addressed some of the difficult issues, some of the hard choices that have to be made. All governments have choices. This government has choices. This government won't make the choices that we need in New Zealand, that workers in New Zealand, that businesses in New Zealand need the government to take to grow the economy, to grow our exports and to grow our wages. Indeed, Fran O'Sullivan said after this budget, and I quote her, "The problem is there is no clear economic growth agenda." Right. About 10 other commentators said the same thing. I'm sure they'd been speaking to each other, but I'm also sure that they had independently come to that same conclusion, because this budget does not have any economic growth agenda, and that's why we continue to fall behind the rest of the world outside of Europe, and that's why this government ought not to be able to use Greece as an excuse any longer. Mr. Speaker, they say it's not their fault. But I think this budget has exposed them. It's exposed them for their own negligence. Can anyone believe that this government got it so wrong in respect of intermediates? Isn't that just incompetence? Isn't that just negligence? Did no one around that cabinet table, did the Minister of Finance, who'd previously said dropping class sizes made educational outcomes worse, did he not ask a question? Did the Prime Minister not ask a question? Did the so-called, the star of their front bench, the up-and-rising Hekia Parata, future leader of the National Party until last week, she obviously didn't ask the question. The negligence of the National Party, their incompetence, is further exposed by that debacle that they are now backtracking on. Mr. Speaker, the budget exposed them as having a lack of vision. A lack of vision. Is there anything in that that would give New Zealanders hope as to why they would want to put their forces behind the New Zealand economy rather than leave to Australia? No, a complete lack of vision. A drab budget is how some people have described it, and they're right. And to return to the point that's been made by so many, they're exposed as having an inadequate plan to grow our economy. Their handling of the public relations around this has even been a debacle. They started skiting about the fact that it was a zero budget. Just weeks ago they were saying a zero budget's a good thing. Then when everyone in New Zealand turned around and said a zero budget's a sign of failure, and the week before the budget they changed their own rhetoric and they denied it was a zero budget. And they said we're spending more money, it's not a zero budget. They've been saying until then it was a zero budget. They changed their mind last week and it's not a zero budget. The problem is that it's a zero budget when it comes to ideas to grow our economy, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, in the face of 53,000 people leaving for Australia in a week, you'd expect that they would be doing something, showing some vision, tackling some of the problems that needed to be tackled. But you know what? National puts off limit virtually any big step they could take. We've proposed quite a few, and I'm going to address them later, but they put them all off the agenda. Their canvas is so flat and devoid of colour, it's a whiteout over there. They cannot see anything for the clouds that John Key keeps hopping from cloud to cloud. Mr. Speaker, our very glib Prime Minister performed like a circus master in the House last week. He was more like a clown, my colleagues say. He was entertaining his train seals around the back and he'd chuck them in another sartoon and they'd clap to their flaps together and they'd have a round of applause, and they're very glib. The glib contributions of the Prime Minister had no substance. He even had the audacity to say that New Zealand's exports are growing. He'd said it a few days earlier before. His problem was, on the very day of his budget speech, Statistics New Zealand said that export goods had dropped by $800 million, an incredible 17% drop year on year. Not, as he said in the question time today, a monthly figure. That was the annual figure for the year to April. They were down by $800 million compared with the year before. He pretends our exports sector is recovering when his own budget shows in the forecast that from here to the end of the projection period, exports increase at only half the rate of imports. We've already got a current account deficit. We already don't cover the cost of our imports and interest by our exports, and his own budget shows that for every year under his projection period out to 2016, it gets worse, and the rate of growth of imports is twice as high as it is of exports. He then pretends that it's all Christchurch, and yet when the Labour Party checked with the Treasury officials when we were in the lockup, because there was another glib statement in the budget document saying a significant part of the current account deficit relates to Christchurch. So we checked. No year is it more than about 1% per annum of the current account deficit. You go out those 3 years and you get up to 6.8% per annum of GDP of a current account deficit. Less than 1%. So we'd still have, if it wasn't for Christchurch, we'd still have a current account deficit growing to 5.8%. Our current account deficit is becoming out of control again. We are returning to old patterns. We've got residential-led growth rather than export-led growth. Mr. Speaker, the government has no plan to address that problem. Let's reflect on what is the central plan of this government's agenda for this 3 years in government. It's to sell our assets. It's to sell our power companies. Now, not only does that make the government deficit worse to the tune of about $100 million per annum, it doesn't change the economy. It doesn't grow our economy. Changing who owns what already exists does not grow our economy. We don't get extra exports. Over time, it'll actually increase our current account deficits with those profit flows to overseas people. It does not grow the output of our economy. Mr. Speaker, why is this? Why is National wedded to this, following this same course which is not cutting the mustard? It's because, sir, they are a Conservative party. Conservative parties around the world, they trim expenditure, they fiddle with the fiscals, but they never address the fundamental changes that are needed. And it's always progressive parties that change things. And that's the fundamental difference in New Zealand and overseas between Conservative parties and progressive parties. Conservative parties, they're basically happy with the status quo. They actually want to protect the status quo because the people that support them have assets that are held up in value by the status quo, at least in the short term. They are not willing to make the progressive changes that progressive parties are willing to make. History shows this time and again in New Zealand. It's the Labour Party that makes the substantial economic changes. The National Party are Conservative and they just fiddle. And I say to National, if you change nothing, nothing changes. It is a truism. If you change nothing, nothing changes, and that's why they haven't rebalanced the economy. Mr. Speaker, New Zealand needs pro-growth tax reform. We need a capital gains tax for a neutral investment signal. We also need it to address some of the inequities in New Zealand and the widening gap between the rich and the poor. We need a research and development tax credit. We need pro-growth savings reform, expanding KiwiSaver to a universal scheme. All of those are off the agenda from National. Not only that, they pretend that superannuation is not a problem. Today, the Minister of Finance didn't even know that by the end of his projection period, superannuation every month costs more than total education costs. This is another example of negligence on their part. Mr. Speaker, all governments have choices. This government has them too. The reason that we do not have export growth and wage growth coming at us down the track is because this government will not make the right choices, and if they change nothing, nothing will change. Just let's not let them blame Greece.
I call order. I call the Honourable Minister Jonathan Coleman.